Hey, those of you in the third row, would you please consider moving to the front row so that our speaker isn't just looking at some empty chairs. Thank you. It's all right. We can talk about it. Yeah. Well, I'll look soon so that we can make an announcement by the end of this session.
There we go. Okay. Tonight, 70% chance of rain. Tomorrow, Friday, 5:46, afternoon showers. 40% is the number they're using. So it's going to be kind of iffy like today. Tuesday, cloudy.
Looking better for next week.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, I think they said we're basically going to get 4 days of moisture. But it's clear on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday.
Why don't we just do Tuesday then? Is that all right with you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so that just means people will be out. So for 2 hours. So
Yes.
they're going to be out longer than 1:45. So we have a couple of people.
Oh no, it doesn't have to be 2 hours. We can get back in time.
Okay.
Because
there's some of you have class right after this, don't you? Pretty sure. It's probably the people that aren't here. Somebody bolts pretty fast out of here.
I have class right after this.
Yeah, and I think Alex might. I know there's at least 2 people.
Oh.
So if we got people back to the parking lot by, what time is your class right after this?
10 minutes after.
10 minutes after the hour?
After we get out of this class, I walk straight for that class.
So if we left, maybe we could leave a little bit early. That's a possibility too.
We left promptly at
If we left right at 12:30, we'd have
12:45.
about 45 minutes.
And then we would need to leave.
Leave there at 1.
Oh yeah, we might film.
Yeah, this would be about 45 minutes. But they might be able to go earlier. How many of you could go at 11:30 on Tuesday? How many of you couldn't? Yeah. Okay. So we're kind of sandwiched.
You know, one way to look at it is we're introducing them to what they need to do there, and they and their group members can always go back on their own time.
Right.
So I think 45 minutes is okay.
On Tuesday?
Yes.
All right. So Friday, what's happening? We here?
We'll meet here on Friday.
All right.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Close enough. So a quick note about the next few days. We're going to meet here tomorrow, Friday. The weather's looking a little iffy. And we will go into the field on Tuesday. It'll be a short field trip, but we'll still be able to get started on our site analysis for a group project. Okay. So tomorrow I will start walking you through the group project and what that entails. And Tuesday, get out on the ground. Any questions about that? Cool. Okay, so Denise, can you see us?
I can. You're a tiny little square in the corner.
Okay, good enough. We cannot see you, but that's all right. We can hear you just fine, and we can see your slides, which is great.
Okay.
So it is my pleasure to welcome Denise Lofman, the current director of the Columbia River Estuary Study Taskforce. You all have certainly heard about this organization plenty from me, but Denise is going to give you some of the highlights of what their priorities and projects look like right now. I've asked her to talk about the organization in general as well as the habitat restoration program. And then later, Denise has been kind enough to loan her staff. So when we get to the phase of talking about project implementation, oversight, really getting things built on the ground, we're going to talk to some of her project managers. And then we'll also be talking to her ecologists and monitoring folks when it comes to that stage of the project lifecycle. So CREST is going to weigh in on 3 different occasions specific to the coming units that we're studying. So we're very, very lucky to have them generously sharing their time with us. Denise, I think I'll send it over to you. We might have one more person step in late, but this is what we got for today, and I'm sure they'll have plenty of questions for you along the way. So thanks so much, Denise, and we'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you, Micah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk a little bit about CREST. Micah had suggested that maybe he suggested for all of us who are going to be giving presentations that we maybe give a little bit of background about ourselves and how we ended up in the positions that we are in at CREST. And so I thought I'd do that really briefly, and then I'll just move right into information about CREST and the work that we're doing. So I came to this work in a little bit of a roundabout way. I do not have a college degree in science. My bachelor's is in history, but I've always been interested in the environment, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines and worked around environmental issues while I was there for 2 years. And I knew that I wanted to work in communities at a grassroots level around environmental issues, and I thought that I'd be doing that internationally. I went and got my master's from Johns Hopkins, their School of Advanced International Studies, in grassroots work, grassroots development work, and was thinking that I was on my way to Indonesia after my master's, and my dad had cancer. And so I just couldn't be that far away from him. So I started looking at environmental nonprofits in the United States where I could still do the type of work that I wanted to do. And so I worked for Global Green USA, which is a nonprofit in Los Angeles, for a few years on renewable energy, the connection between energy and water, and also on green building. And then things kind of settled down at home and were stable with my family, and I thought, okay, well, now I can kind of venture further afield. And I applied for the position with the Watershed Council in Tillamook, which is just a little south of Astoria where we work. And I got that job, and I was a Watershed Council coordinator for 8 years. And Watershed Council coordinators do a whole lot of watershed restoration and work really closely with local communities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about watershed councils in Oregon a little later in my presentation. And then about 5.5 years ago, I moved into the director position at CREST. And really enjoy my work here, really enjoy the people I work with. We're a small group, we're about 11 people who work for CREST. And so now I'm going to move into talking about giving you an overview of CREST. And I know Mike has talked about CREST a lot, so I might be repeating some of the things he said, and if so, I'm sorry about that, but we'll just kind of keep it moving. So, a little bit about CREST. What is CREST? Why were we formed? What do we do? Those kinds of things. So CREST is a council of governments, also known as a COG, and we serve local governments surrounding the Columbia River Estuary. We provide land use planning and special project assistance for member jurisdictions, and we act as a regional planning body. And then we have our habitat restoration program where we assist the Bonneville Power Administration and the Army Corps of Engineers with salmon recovery efforts in the estuary. So I want to give you a little bit of a history about CREST. So we were formed in 1974, in order to develop the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan through a local collaborative process. Lots of development was being proposed in the estuary, and there was no guiding document or guiding vision for how land should be developed. And so CREST was formed, and member jurisdictions are from both the Oregon and Washington side of the river, and they're made up of counties and cities, and we have one port that's a member. And so that document was completed in 1979. And while that planning process that land use planning process was occurring, there was also this understanding that there was a need for science about the estuary. And so there was another program developed called the Columbia River Estuary Data Development Program, or CREDT, where scientists spread across the estuary and gathered data and information. And CREST was involved in that. And so from there, we've continued to do land use planning for local jurisdictions, and we've continued to do work in the estuary. The Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds was developed in the mid-1990s. That's when coho salmon was going to be listed as endangered. And Oregon thought, you know what, we want to look at how we address endangered species in a little bit of a different way. And so the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds created watershed councils, there's like 90 of them across the state. And they're really an experiment in community-based natural resource management, because their councils are made up of local folks who sit on this, on a board. They meet once a month and they decide, where can we do good work in our watershed? How can we help with improving habitat? Because habitat loss really is one of the main drivers of ESA listing. And so CREST got involved in this work in the mid-90s, and there's funds available through the state. And so there were grants available to start to do this kind of restoration. And then we received our Bonneville Power Administration contract in 2010. We were receiving funds from them, but through another entity. And Micah was very much involved and responsible for getting us that contract. And so, folks have always been like, well, you always have had the planning side, but the restoration side seems a little bit like a part of what you do, but why has it always been a big piece of it? And I had a conversation a couple years ago with a PhD student who was doing his dissertation on mitigation plans in the United States. And so part of his dissertation entailed researching mitigation plans and seeing how far back they go. And CREST wrote one when we developed the Columbia River Estuary Management Plan. As part of that planning process, we also developed a mitigation plan for development. So when development occurred, there could be mitigation in other places. And mitigation plans that came after that across the country kind of mirrored the original plan that CREST wrote. And that was really interesting to me because I hadn't known that. And I thought, well, we've been involved in habitat restoration then since the absolute very beginning of CREST. And so we kind of have these two arms. We currently have 9 member jurisdictions on our council. They're from both Washington and Oregon. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our governance because, when you get involved if you move it on to doing watershed restoration, you'll be working for lots of different entities, but some entities are like nonprofits or, kind of governmental like we are. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about our governance so you have an understanding of how that works. So each member jurisdiction appoints one elected and one staff member to the CREST Council. Each jurisdiction has one vote on the CREST Council. Each member pays an annual membership fee and receives discounted rates for service. The CREST Council meets quarterly, and the council sets policy and approves the annual budget and the audit and hires and oversees the director, but they don't have any involvement really in our day-to-day operations. The other interesting thing about CREST as a COG, as a Council of Governments, is most COGs in the Pacific Northwest that I've looked into and that I've spoken with, the majority of their budgets come from their members. So like 80 to 90% of their budget is provided by their members because they provide these services to their members. CREST is not like that at all. Less than 1% of our budget comes from our members. Our entire budget is really made up of grants and contracts to do the work that we do. It's forced CREST, and I think we've always been this way, to be very entrepreneurial, to look for opportunities where there might be contracts or grants that match up really well with the work that we do. And I think that's been the case since the very beginning, and it remains true now. On the planning side of work, I just want to touch on that a little bit so you know a little bit about what we do on the planning side. We assist with current land use planning, so that's like a community development department of a city. Someone comes to them and says, I want to build a house on this piece of property. You have to go for a permit for that. And some entities that we work with have staff turnover. Several of them are having a lot of staff turnover right now. So we're doing a lot of just that basic kind of current planning. And then in addition to that, we assist with things like shoreline inventories or wetland inventories. We're working with 2 of the beach communities here on the coast. They have to redo their 4-dune management plan, so how they manage their dunes in the city. We're helping them write those. We're working with a city on the Washington side of the river that owns a portion of their watershed where they get their drinking water, and they'd like to purchase. Weyerhaeuser owns some timber rights and wants to cut, and they're like, we would really rather not have any massive cutting in our watershed, so we're working with them to figure out how we can help them find funds to purchase those timber rights and to purchase the rest of the land so they own their own watershed and they can manage it for drinking water purposes. And so those are some of the planning projects and special projects that we do. And then we have the habitat restoration and monitoring side. And you'll be hearing from those staff members over the next couple weeks. And so they're going to dive into detail about what they do. And so I'm going to kind of give you an overview of the habitat restoration program and why we do what we do in it. So restoration and I will say, so these are all. This is a picture of a project that we've done. I'm not going to be talking about it, but most of the pictures of restoration are all pictures of projects that we've completed. So I really can't talk about restoration in the estuary unless I talk about what triggered this. Why is there this big push for restoration in the Columbia River estuary? And the most significant reason for implementing restoration is habitat loss, and I'm sure this is not surprising to you. Studies conducted on the Columbia River by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership and the EPA comparing land cover from the late 1800s to those in 2010 show a 68 to 70% loss in tidal wetland habitat. This habitat is critical for juvenile salmonids that utilize the lower river for refuge and rearing. And the majority of this loss was due to conversion of tidal wetlands to agricultural uses, mainly through the construction of levees and ditching. And urban development has also had a significant role. This map that you see was created by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, and it classifies restorable land in the Columbia River right at the mouth. The green areas depict lands that are existing habitat but may benefit from enhancement work. And then the yellow areas depict areas that are restorable for salmonid habitat, and the red areas indicate lands that are not restorable and are considered lost to development. So this extensive loss of habitat has negatively impacted salmon populations, and there are currently 13 species of Columbia River Basin salmon and steelhead listed for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So, again, more why on why we're doing this restoration on the Columbia. There's the operation of the Federal Columbia River Power System, also the acronym is FCRPS, affects the 13 species of salmon and steelhead. And the Endangered Species Act requires that the federal agencies that operate the FCRPS, called action agencies, ensure that their actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species, nor that they result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat designed for its conservation. And so basically, the Army Corps, Bonneville Power Administration, and Bureau of Reclamation are the 3 action agencies, and they are required by the Endangered Species Act to do no harm. And so there's been a biological opinion that provides restoration mandates, performance goals, and research monitoring and evaluation goals. And the BIOP requires a series of mitigation measures called reasonable and prudent alternatives. And one of these reasonable and prudent alternatives listed in this BIOP is Columbia River Estuary Restoration Projects. And, you know, BPA in particular has spent a lot of money upriver for a long time, but the science in the estuary just took a little longer for folks to see that, because the assumption for many years was that the juveniles were just like bombing right through the estuary and heading out to sea. But research by NOAA and other entities in some estuaries further south in Oregon have shown that that is the case. But that's because what you're doing is, because the habitat doesn't exist, you're not triggering life cycle histories to occur. But if you provide habitat, those life cycle actions will begin to occur in the fish. And so that science is why all of a sudden estuary restoration became more important and is more funded now by Bonneville Power. So a little bit more on reasonable and prudent alternatives. It includes a program of actions to improve estuary habitat limiting factors, and the goal is improving survival for all populations. And the measures include protecting and restoring riparian and off-channel habitat, reconnecting floodplains, increasing fish access to productive habitat, and reducing predation. We're basically restoring or building habitat for juveniles. And I like to tell people we are just moving a lot of mud around, removing soils and allowing areas to become inundated that were not before. This photo is a picture of Otter Point, which is a project we completed in 2012. Michael was involved in it before he left. And it's 33 acres of habitat. You can see the opening right there next to the big levee. We built a new Army Corps levee there, but we also opened that site up in 5 locations. And that area back there had not been wet in over 100 years. And as someone who's worked in watershed health and restoration for a long time, being able to stand on that levee and watch the high tide come in that day was pretty special. And so we move a lot of mud and we allow water to enter areas where it hasn't been in a long time. And that's a lot of what we do, these large scale construction projects. So I want to talk a little bit about our habitat restoration process. We identify and prioritize and develop potential habitat restoration projects by looking across the landscape and seeing places where it might make sense, where we're not going to be impacting infrastructure, where there's levees that might already be failing, where there's willing landowners. And that's really key. I want to talk about this for a little bit. CREST is not a regulatory agency. We do not force anybody to do anything. We work with willing landowners. And because CREST is a governmental entity, we've actually developed really great relationships with governmental agencies that own and steward land. Like the National Park Service. This project is an example of that partnership. And it's great because the Lewis and Clark National Historical Park really wants their landscape, when visitors come to see it, to not look like the farmland, that is to the other side of the levee, but they want it to look like it looked like when Lewis and Clark arrived. And so they call them, there's a quote in one of the journals that talks about these quagmires of mud. And so that's what we're helping the park put back. And it also works for the park because one of their mandates is also to restore ecological functions on the land that they own. So it's a great partnership. We have another really good partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a great partnership with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And these entities all own a lot of property in the estuary, and when the goals between what they need on the land and what CREST can do and how we can bring in particularly Bonneville Power funding, it makes this really great win-win situation. And then it also occurs with private landowners, but not as much. Much of our work is done more with the governmental entities. We scope and select restoration projects based on technical evaluation and scientific review. Our projects are reviewed by Bonneville multiple times. They have a scientific review panel that looks at all of our projects, and they score the projects, and that gives both BPA and us an understanding of how much money we have to spend on a project, because they need a cost-benefit ratio for these projects because they can be very expensive. And so they're looking like, how much habitat benefit are we getting for the money that we're spending? And so this review by the scientists, one, tells them if it's a good project and scientifically based, and two, it tells them how much, in terms of a cost-benefit ratio, they should be spending on these projects.
Hey, Denise.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that cost-benefit analysis just a little bit and provide a little more detail around that review process?
Sure.
I don't think that's not something I've gone into a lot of detail.
Okay.
With.
Well, and I think you'll find every funder does this when they're looking at habitat restoration projects, and they all do it in different ways. But I'll talk about the way that BPA does it. So the way that BPA looks at a project, what happens is, so CREST will identify a project, and we'll be like, we think this project meets BPA goals, and we think it also will come in at a price that BPA will be willing to pay because the cost-benefit ratio we think matches. And we'll get permission from BPA to move forward with feasibility. So when we do that, we look at a project and we say, okay, what can we do here? We're not going to be are we going to impact neighbors? If we're going to impact neighbors, what do we need to do so we don't impact neighbors? Do we need, if we're going to drop a levee, do we need to build a levee? And where, what should the project look like? So in the feasibility stage, we're looking at different alternatives for what the project might look like. We're looking at what the costs of the different alternatives may be. How much dirt are we going to need to move? How much dirt are we going to need to take away, which can get very expensive? And how much dirt might we need to bring in? And so those kinds of, that kind of look is what happens in the feasibility stage. And then we move into design, and we do design at 30, 60, 90. And at about 30, they like us to come around 30% design. We'll develop a map, and they call it a goal map. So you develop a map that shows the work that you're planning to do on site, and there's a template that you write up where you talk about the benefits of the project. And then it goes before this group of folks called the Expert Regional Technical Group, or ERTIG. And it's made up of scientists from throughout the Pacific Northwest, fish biologists, ecologists, specialists in habitat restoration, and they're, what the ODFW, the guy who led all of the habitat surveys in Oregon for like 20 years sits on it. One of the lead fish biologists from NOAA sits on it. A scientist who works up in the Puget Sound sits on it. So it's a lot of folks with a lot of experience on fish and restoration, and they'll take a look at the project and they'll score it. And scoring based on the actions that you're taking. Are you dropping a levee? Are you just putting a tide gate through it? Are you putting a culvert through it? How much land are you restoring? How much land are you wetting? And those different ways of doing a project, and so if you're putting in a new culvert, let's say you're taking out a small culvert and you're putting in a big one, and then you're doing a little bit of habitat restoration behind the culvert, that gets one kind of score, and it's a little lower than if you say you go in and you completely drop a levee and let the entire area wet. That's going to get a much higher score. And so, there's all these kind of, when they look at it, they're like, okay, they're doing these actions and we're going to get this much new habitat or this much enhanced habitat. And that gives you a score. And then the score is based on, they're called SBUs, or survival benefit units. And that score of how many SBUs you'll have gives you an estimate of how much money you'll have. So right now, 100 acres of habitat restoration is, that's one SBU. And that will give you around $3 million for a project.
Nice. Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for elaborating.
Yeah. Now, but I will say, most of our projects are way below 1 SBU. They're like 0.33 SBUs or 0.6 SBUs. And there's folks in the estuary who are like, we should only be doing big projects. But you saw that map of the habitat loss. And you can't always work in really large scale areas. So what CREST does is we focus on these smaller areas where we know we have a willing landowner or a couple willing landowners. We can go in there and get 0.33 SBUs. But here's the thing. Over time, those 0.33s add up. And CREST has provided the majority of the SBUs in the estuary. Because we just crank them out, and even though they're small, over time they add up. So there is this tension about doing bigger projects versus doing smaller projects. But we're just, because it's voluntary, the work is voluntary, we just kind of truck along it with the smaller projects for the most part.
And does BPA have a SBU, salmon benefit unit, target for a certain timeline that they're trying to meet? For example, as I recall, they were trying to get a certain number of SBUs done by the 2018 buy-up deadline.
Yes.
Do they have those kind of targets that you're aware of?
Yes. The goal for the 2018 buy-up was 40 SBUs, but I think everybody recognized as they started moving this process forward that 40 was not feasible. I think they have somewhere between I think they have around 10, 12, somewhere in there. And so, and while the buy-up, the 2018 buy-up is now being rewritten for a new buy-up, I do know for certain that habitat restoration in the estuary is going to continue. The issue has been, we did a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We had a long list of projects that we wanted to implement, and they were the quote-unquote easy ones, although they weren't all easy. But what we're finding now is the projects that we're trying to do are more complicated and more expensive because the easier and cheaper ones have all been done. So the cost-benefit ratio for the projects, and BPA is talking about this, it's going to have to shift a little bit because we have a number of projects now that are good projects, but they're, for multiple reasons, they're too expensive and they don't meet that cost-benefit ratio. And so BPA is like, no, you can't do them. So then what we do is try and go find other funding so we can bring other funding to the table and be like, okay, BPA, you don't have to pay for all of it. But it makes projects much, much more difficult to do. And so, as the program has evolved, things have just shifted, and projects are a little harder. We used to try to do 3 to 5 projects a year, implement that many, and now we're more like 2 to 3, simply because the challenges have become greater in getting them on the ground.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. And then the other part of the restoration process is the action effectiveness monitoring and research of restoration projects. And April and Narayan are going to talk to you all about that. So here's a map of all the projects that we've implemented since 2010. There's a couple of projects that were just implemented last summer that are on here.
Expand that to a running PowerPoint.
Denise, can you expand that to a slideshow or something so that we can get a closer look at it?
Lower right.
Sure, I'm sorry. I should have done
No problem.
There we go.
There it is.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you.
So as you can see, there's multiple projects. We have 2 project managers based in Astoria, and we have 1 based in Portland. And so you can see all the ones that have been implemented up in Portland, and then a number of them at the mouth. So that's since 2010. We have a very large project that's happening up near Portland this summer. Tom will talk all about it, I'm sure. It was an Army Corps of Engineers project that they were doing in partnership with BPA, and BPA got irritated with them because they were taking forever, because the Army Corps they take a long time. It's just the nature of that bureaucracy, and they were making the project really expensive. So they handed the project off to us and said, hey, could you implement this in 18 months? And we are. So that one's called Sturgeon Lake. Hopefully Tom will talk about it a little bit. And then Jason, who will also be presenting, is implementing a project closer to the mouth called Bear Marys and Ferris this summer. So, 2 this summer, one of them really large. The Sturgeon Lake project is a $3 million project. So pretty exciting. So I wanted to talk, Madeline, this portion of the slideshow was actually Madeline, who's our was Madeline's portion, our Habitat Restoration Program Manager, and she wanted to be sure to talk about grant writing a little bit. So securing funds for your projects is key, and so here are some of the suggestions that Madeline put down in terms of the way that we at CREST we think about funding. So know what's out there, know what funding sources are available, when the grant cycles are, and when awarded grants will become available. Because when you're building your pipeline of projects, you want to make sure that you've got your funding source matching up with where you are in the projects. So that's really key. And when possible, start with the most locally specific funding sources. For example, we always prefer to look for funding sources that are going to be looking for projects specifically within the Columbia River Estuary, because this not only gives us the best chance because of a smaller applicant pool, it will also certainly have criteria and objectives that will line up with our project goals and objectives. Now, sometimes you can't get local, sometimes they're national, but trying to match up, what your local goals are with whatever that source of funding is looking for is key. Plan ahead for the timing. And then the other piece is apply for multiple sources of funding, because you're never quite sure how much you're going to get. We had a project that we implemented in winter of 2016 on the Washington side of the river. BPA didn't want to fund it because it was really small. They funded a tiny portion of it. So we went after grants and thought we were all set. We're getting ready to implement in 2015, went out to bid, got the bids back from all the contractors, and we didn't have enough money. So we had to go back, to the drawing board and go back to our funders. Thankfully, the funders in Washington will sometimes provide more, and so that's what they did. And we also wrote a couple grants and got some more money. But so it helped. Right now, we're really fortunate. We have this BPA contract. They fund most of our projects. For the most part, they fund all of our when we have a project that's funded by BPA, most of the time it's fully funded by BPA. But when I talked about the projects becoming more complicated, we're having to do more grant writing because we're doing projects where we need to bring match in order to make the cost-benefit ratio match for BPA. So it's like a puzzle that you're kind of putting together. The other piece about grant writing, what I would have to say about it is you're really telling a story when you write a grant. And so being really detailed, knowing what story you want to tell, what is the end goal that you're trying to get to, those things are all really important in grant writing. So establishing landowner relationships and community relationships, like I said, CREST doesn't make anyone do anything on their land. And so for us, it's really important that we have willing landowners and that we have good relationships with the landowners we're working with. And it's critical to a successful restoration project. So over the years, we've found that the best way to establish relationships is to get to know the landowners. We've written letters, and then in the letter, we've said we'd really like to meet with you. Sometimes you have to be persistent. Madeline said, sometimes you have to be persistent, but try not to be annoying. If you're able to meet with them, that's awesome. If you can meet with them out on site, that can be great. Sometimes it's easier to have them come into the office, but ask them about the property and their history with it. How did they come to live there or acquire it? What are their long-term goals for the property? And this applies both to private property owners and to public property owners, to government entities that own land. You really want to make sure when you're looking at a piece of land for a project that what you're wanting to do there matches up with what they want on their land, because you want all of your projects to be win-wins. What typically happens is there's usually some compromise somewhere, but everybody gets the majority of what they want. So this is a project that I'm going to talk a little bit about around landowners. This is Nat Creek. There was 2 phases done. This is the first phase. And so in the photos you can see there's like a pond in the bigger picture, and then in the smaller picture you can see all the grass. So this piece of land was owned by, or is owned by, Oregon Department of Forestry, and we wanted to do some habitat restoration, and they said you can. They said, but we've got this pond. There's this road that goes across, and the water is ponding behind. It's become a nuisance. People are dumping trash in there. They're leaving elk carcasses there. It's really a problem for us, and we don't want that road there. So you can totally do the project, but could you take out that road and allow the water to just flow downstream without any blockages? And we said sure. So that smaller photo is a picture of after the project was done. The pond was no longer there, and it became much more natural. And this is an example of where there was a win-win. So Nat Creek really exemplifies a wide array of landowner issues. As I said, it was a 2-phase project. So the first project reestablished estuarine processes to a 20-acre wetland through dike breaching in 2012, and phase 2 restored an additional 70 acres in the same reach in 2013. We've removed 550 linear feet of levee during phase 1 and breached the levee in 5 locations during phase 2. We improved in-stream habitat complexity with large woody debris, and we renaturalized the tributary habitat by removing the earthen dam on Oregon Department of Forestry property. So you can see on the photos the excavators working. On the phase 2, you can see the excavator on the barge. So that land on phase 2 was already wet, and the only way to get the excavator out there was to barge it out there. So we've done a number of projects where we've actually barged levees out. So these maps will give you an indication well, I'll explain these maps. So phase 1, that whole yellow section was owned by ODF. We were able to go in and do the tributary work and then do the work on the levee and get about 20 acres more wet than they were before. And then for the phase 2, you can see the section that's crosshatched. So Madeline was the project manager on this, and so she'd done a lot. She'd done outreach to these landowners on this section of Nat Creek, and had sent letters, and just above the hatched portion and below the hatched portion within the yellow, there's 2 landowners there. They were totally on board with the project, thought it was great. It was already wet. The one landowners, they don't have a house here, and they were like, they had acquired it from an uncle, and they were like, he had an old camping site like out on the levee, and we just want that portion to remain there. And that was great. And the other folks lived up on the hill and had said, this is part of our view shed, so if you just make it more wet and more natural, that works fine for us. So, but the crosshatch section, those folks, so Madeline, I think, sent like maybe 3 letters, and they finally called and left a message and basically said, stop bothering us. We don't want you to do anything on our property. And we said, okay. So we've sent them a reply letter stating what we were going to be doing and that we would not be working on their land at all. And sometimes with projects, when you have a landowner that's not interested, it can halt the project. We were really fortunate with this one, it didn't. We just worked around them. And we also let them know that they'd learn more about the project through the permitting process when that occurred. And so we were able to implement, instead of a 90+ acre project, we implemented a 70-acre project with 2 property owners. And so that kind of is kind of an example of how we work with landowners and how we move projects forward. And I think that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question with respect to that project. The land there is already wet, and so you weren't concerned in this case of increasing inundation on the exclusion area. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And you didn't have to do any modeling or anything like that to demonstrate it?
No, because it was already wet and there wasn't any infrastructure there, so we weren't impacting that property in any way, because it, other than it's a little more wet now, but that's all. Yeah.
Okay, great. Other questions? Go ahead, Colby.
I have a question about that project as well. With that landowner, like reducing it to the 70 acres, I think you said, from the 90, did you have to go back to like your funders and explain that to them? And has that ever been an issue in the past?
No, because that work with reaching out to landowners and figuring out where we can work really needs to occur in the early stages of project planning. And so as long, you should have, as long as things, so in my mind, you should know who you're going to be able to work with and who you're not going to be able to work with early in the process. And so in that case, like, if you're like, we really want to work on this land, but the landowner won't ever call us back, more than likely you're not going to be working on that property, and you'll know that early on. I will say we've had one instance with a project where everybody was on board. It was a project in a city. The city was on board. The special district was on board. CREST was on board. We did a lot of work to get everybody on board. And then when we got close to implementation, the city pulled out for political reasons. And in that case, we just had to walk away from the project. And so, partnerships can fall apart. I think they require a lot of care and feeding, making sure folks know what's going on. And you can do your very best in all this, and it can still go sideways. So, we're really careful and very cautious with our landowner relationships. We provide them all the information we possibly can, are in contact with them on a regular basis. If we're going to be out on their land, we call and make sure that that's okay, once they've agreed to the project. So we really try to not surprise people. And then, care and feeding of project partners and landowners, really, really important. And most of the time it'll go forward well, and sometimes it does go sideways. Yeah, and that can be tough.
Go ahead.
Do you ever have issues where a landowner is not maybe interested early on, but they want to come on later, and that creates like a funding issue because you need more funding to try to incorporate that person into the project?
We have not had that happen. Typically, because when we're looking at a project, we know what lands we want to work on, and so we've talked to everybody, and we really haven't had, that's an interesting question. It's been, I think when you get a very clear affirmative, like, no, we're not interested, I typically haven't seen that shift. Now, where it might is when the community is a tight one and people know each other and they talk to each other a lot, and there's a lot of trust in that community, because the landowner may not totally trust CREST, But as they see the other landowners feeling really comfortable with a project, that could shift. I could see that occurring in certain instances. But we haven't had that happen specifically.
At this point, is BPA obligated to spend money on habitat restoration legally?
Yes, it is a reasonable and prudent alternative in the 2018 BIOP, and it will be in the new BIOP as well.
So when are they going to have to change their SBU units to like the 100 acres, the cost benefit? When is that going to have to shift for them to quit denying projects that aren't what they consider the cost benefit analysis to be worth it for them?
Yeah, I think they're in conversations right now with, I think because they're redoing the 2018 BIOP, there's going to be a new BIOP. And I think that new BIOP will reflect these issues. But the new BIOP probably won't be released until at least, I would say, 2020 or 2021. So for now, we're just kind of in a holding pattern and moving forward with what we can within what fits within that cost-benefit ratio. And then projects that are above that, we're looking for other, like I said, we're looking for other funding sources. So then BPA's portion of funding for the project goes down and makes them, it makes it more likely that they will help to fund projects, is what we're finding.
And then on that map that you had of all the projects that were feasible, what's the total acreage that the different colors are representing? Do you have
You mean of the habitat loss?
No, the map in the slideshow that shows the areas within the estuary that are feasible projects and that slide.
Oh, I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I'm just curious to see like how long is the funding from EPA going to be useful before they run out of like estuary projects to fund? Like what I'm thinking, like moving forward, what are they going to be forced to do if they can't provide more habitat restoration? What the alternative might be?
Yeah, there's decades worth of work going forward. We're not anywhere near close where something like that would be an issue.
Good question.
Denise, I've got a couple of questions. I'm kind of policy person.
Okay.
So a couple of questions on policy. So with the current administration, we see lots of things going on the executive side of government, which could directly trickle down onto your opportunities and sort of indirectly in your operations. So I have two questions for you about that. One of them is, do you see now any changes in the way EPA is operating relative to the way they were operating before the past year on projects that you work on?
No, and the reason why is because BPA is really a unique entity.
EPA, I'm saying EPA.
Oh, EPA. Well, EPA, we haven't seen it directly, and partially that's because we don't have any EPA funding right now. So I can't speak, well, I can speak to a couple. So we work closely with the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership is another entity that works in the estuary. And then there's another, so there's estuary partnerships across the United States. There's 28 of them, and they're designated as special estuaries of concern for the country. And so, you know, they're really important in the Columbia. They're also really important on the Oregon coast, and their funding was completely stripped out of the proposed budget. You know, so those are two entities that are doing great work in habitat restoration and watershed work, and you know, and I guess the administration feels like they just shouldn't be funded anymore. None of them, all 28 of them across the country. The good news is that Congress takes a different perspective and the funds were put back. But that's the kind of thing that I'm seeing. I'm also seeing on the land use planning side, funds for coastal zone management for the So the CZARA, the Coastal Zone Management Act that was passed in 1972, which speaks to how jurisdictions in coastal areas need to do land use planning and manage their coastal zone. Those funds typically come from NOAA, and those were also stripped out. So you can imagine that entities all around the country that have coastlines, we're going to lose federal funding that helps them manage those according to requirements in federal law. That's also very problematic, and again, Congress put the money back. So there's these decisions being made at the executive level, and then Congress, because congressmen and senators have an understanding of the needs of these for these funds in their states, and so they're being put back. But those are two examples of things that are pretty close to us, not that are that impact the other folks we work with.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the second question is about the Army Corps. And so there's a growing concern that the Army Corps is a slow, sort of slovenly organization that takes forever to get anything done. So there's alternatives on the table for placing it in other agencies. NOAA is one of them. There are several others. Do you all have a position on that, or a specific interest about that? I bring it up because you mentioned that they are kind of a broken piece in the wheel.
Yeah, so there's, I hadn't heard that. So there's like interest in having like NOAA take over portions of part of what Army Corps does.
Well, they're talking about moving Army Corps out of DOD and into one of those agencies, yeah.
Oh, well, that would be interesting. So what we've found is a lot of times when we've had, like we had a great project where we had to rebuild a levee, and it would have been a Section 408 levee, so it would have had to have gone through the Corps' Section 408 process. Those projects are the ones that we can't move forward because the timelines are long. So we did our first Section 408 in 2012, and it was like a year-long process, and it cost, I think, $200,000. But now they're saying, it's going to take 3 years to review our engineering, and it's going to cost $300,000. And then the folks who work at BPA actually have added more money on top of that. So that BPA is like, it's actually going to be probably more like 4 years and $700,000. And that, for this particular project I'm talking about, that's more than the actual construction budget. Mm-hmm. So you can see why, I'm frustrated with them. And I don't know how to shift the culture there. I think there's a very entrenched kind of bureaucratic culture that can be difficult. Yes.
So
I don't know if moving it to another agency will change it. It might.
Right.
It might, but I don't know for sure.
So are you excluding those types of projects from your agenda in the next few years? Are you just not going to consider doing them?
So our BPA has been pretty clear that they don't want to pay for any Section 408s. So yeah, we have another project that we're in very early stages of, and BPA was basically like, if you can get the levee deauthorized rather than having to build a new levee,
oh my God,
then we'll let you move it forward. But if you can't get it deauthorized, then you probably can't do the project.
All right, so can you define deauthorization for us?
Sure. So, and this project can be deauthorized. It's awesome. So sometimes there's levees out there that have, been part of a diking district that's been defunct for decades. The levees do not protect any infrastructure. The levees are already failing. Maybe they're just levees for small portions of land. And when that occurs, when the levees aren't actually protecting infrastructure, you can get Army Corps to deauthorize it. But that takes an act of Congress, literally. So for the project that we're working on right now, I've reached out to our Congresswoman's office, and they have taken like a look at it, and there's the Water Resources Development Act, gets reauthorized every 2 years, and so it's up for reauthorization this year. It should be going to the floor in like April. And so in order to move this forward, the Congresswoman's office had to write a letter to the Army Corps and ask them to take an unofficial look to see if we could deauthorize. We'd already asked them to do that, and Army Corps had told us that that we could deauthorize it. They thought it was a great example of a place where we could do deauthorization. And then it will go back to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee at the House. They will ask for a more formal review, which Army Corps will do, and then hopefully, and then there's all their boxes they have to check, but hopefully it will be in the Water Resources Development Act of 2018, and once the levy is deauthorized, Army Corps' interest in it is done, and we can do whatever we want out there. Now, what's interesting is the Congresswoman's office had reached out to me and said, well, the Army Corps is totally open to like reviewing all your plans and making sure that you're not making other properties wet. And we said, no, 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 no. The whole point of this is so that Army Corps doesn't do any review of our project. And we're so early, we don't even have any plans, you know. And so we're hopeful that the Army Corps' interest in this levy will be gone because Congress says that it is, and then we'll be able to move the project forward. And there's this project. I know of another project that's going through this process for the 2018 WRDA, and then there was a large project, the Woluski project, the Richard Lee property, Micah. It went through deauthorization, I believe, as well, because there wasn't any infrastructure that needed to be protected.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, deauthorization was something that we really weren't willing to consider during my time there. It's interesting that that's become the main workaround. So thank you for elaborating on that.
Yep.
One of the things that I was reading through the bill that was passed by the House yesterday, which will almost certainly pass the Senate, which is the federal funding bill, which does not include that reauthorization. But one of the things that happened in that bill is that many, many riders were attached to it under the auspices of infrastructure, which the executive branch wants money for. A whole bunch of water development projects were added and successfully passed without any resistance. So what that means is that the people that want water projects to be included in this great new infrastructure investment in the country are so far successful, at least in the first round. So that bodes well for your mission in general.
Yeah.
Other questions? Anthony?
So you had talked about briefly what happens if you go a little bit over budget and you have to request more funding from the funding agencies. Have you ever run into situations where either you got more grants approved than you had anticipated, or you were under budget for some reason where you had excess money?
Well, I mean, that happens. It can happen on occasion, even with our BPA projects, where, you know, when you design a project, your engineers will give you an engineer's estimate of what that project will cost, and that's typically what we use to set the amount of money that we need. But what often has happened in the past, it's shifting a little bit. Everybody's getting more expensive. But we would implement projects, and we would say, okay, the construction budget for this is $400,000, but the bids would come in between like $250,000 and $300,000, so there'd be $100,000 that we didn't need. And for BPA, that works out well because that money stays in our contract, and we can move it around to other projects that may need it. If you've gone after, say, a state grant, and you have more money than you need, you just simply don't use it because the money is dedicated to that project. It's not like you, particularly if I'm thinking about the projects that we fund through the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board or the Washington Salmon Recovery Board, those funds are restricted to those projects. So if you don't need all the money, then you don't get all the money. The other piece of it is we don't get our funds until after we do the work. So we do the work, we get an invoice, we send the invoice to whoever the funder is, and the funder sends us the money. So you know, everything's really above board, very transparent, and you can't really, most of the time, you can't really move the money between like different projects, except in our BPA contract because it's funding multiple projects and is set up a little bit differently.
Excellent, thank you.
So you don't get a mid-project payment? You get always on the BPA stuff? It's always ended?
What did you ask?
I was just asking, you don't get a mid-term payment, a mid-project payment? You get all your money at the end of the project?
No, we get our money as we get invoices. So let's say we're doing design and, you know, the engineers will send us an invoice for, you know, 40 grand. We'll send that on to BPA. They'll pay us the 40 grand. We'll pay the engineer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, could you describe the 30, 60, 90 design approach? We've talked in this class about design build versus, we've talked about separating the design and the build processes versus contracting someone to seamlessly do both in different scenarios where you would desire those different approaches, but I don't think we've talked about 30, 60, 90, so maybe you could just define that for us.
Sure. So I will say, you know, design build, we've tried it a couple different times. It would not, at this point, it would never be my first choice. I would always want to separate the engineering and the building, if that's at all possible, and that's how we're doing all of our projects going forward, unless there would be a special reason, but I don't know what that would be. So 30, 60, 90, what happens is we get an okay to go forward with a project. So we'll put together a request for proposal, an RFP, for a design consultant, or it's an engineering firm. And then we'll send it out and we'll get proposals back, and we go through and we score those. We do not have to take the lowest bidder. Sometimes we will, sometimes we won't. And then we'll hire this engineering firm to do feasibility, which is typically looking at, it's often maybe some modeling. It's like early analysis of the different, what different types of alternatives that we could do on the project, and it's looking at costs for those analysis, for those alternatives. And then once you have to pick your alternative, and sometimes that's really easy and sometimes it's not. That back and forth, it's an iterative process with the engineers. We're really involved, so they're constantly sending us information. We're giving them feedback. And so then once you select your alternatives, you can move to 30% designs. And once you have 30% designs, you can get your engineering budget, the construction budget, starting to come together. And 30% designs is often where there's a lot of changes made, 30 and 60%, where you're like, okay, this will work, this won't, we need to change this. And if you have project partners that you're working with, either landowners or like some of our projects are on state highways with like WashDOT, they'll take a look at the plans and be like, okay, you need to change these things, this isn't according to spec, we don't like that. And so then the plans go back to the engineering firm, and they take all those comments and desired changes, and they put them in the plan set, and then you get your 60%. And that same process will occur. And then you get to 90%, and typically between 60 and 90%, the changes are smaller. That's the goal, is that you've gotten the big changes happening between 30 and 60. And then you have 100% designs. And once you hit 90% designs, you can probably go forward with your permitting and your environmental compliance at the state level for us, and at the federal level with Army Corps.
Great. Yeah, we're going to be meeting with a WDF&W habitat engineer soon, and that sets the stage for that conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I think I have one last question if no one else.
I got one others.
Go for it.
You talked about how you're moving past the initial stage of low-hanging fruit, smaller projects, more manageable situations into what you described as a larger project kind of phase. Can you just talk a little bit more about the implications of that for your organization?
Sure. So we're still doing smaller projects, but those smaller projects are more complicated. And so the implications for us that I'm actually seeing on the ground is that projects are taking longer. You know, CREST is small, we're really nimble, people like are super self-motivated. So having a restoration project start with feasibility and be implemented in a year in the past was not unusual, particularly projects that weren't super complicated. Now they all seem to be just a little more complicated. So even projects that we think are going to be like able to be designed and implemented in a year, that's not necessarily happening. Something will come up and all of a sudden it'll halt the project in its tracks. And what's also happening is the funding, because these projects are just more complicated, they're taking more time and they're taking more money. And so what that is meaning is we cannot rely on BPA to fully fund all of our projects anymore. Project managers are having to write multiple grants in order to fund projects, in order to move them forward. You know, we can get a portion from BPA, but then we're going to need portions of funding from other places. So it's making, and it's easier to do a project when you have one funder that you know will fund the whole thing. It's way harder when you're having to patchwork the money together. And we're really lucky. Most watershed restoration entities are patchworking their funds. Most of the time, I'd say like 80 to 90% of the time. So, we're really fortunate to have BPA and to have BPA for the majority of our projects. But as we're working on, projects that aren't quite as straightforward, they're taking more time, they're taking more money, and they're requiring different skills. Grant writing, managing multiple grants, in a way that when we just had BPA, it wasn't as big, that wasn't happening.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else want to jump in? Okay, I have one last question for you, Denise. You alluded to the politics that derailed one of your projects and a municipality walking away. Could you just add a little more detail to that so we can understand the social dynamics on the ground?
Sure. I think there are some, so I'll just kind of give you some of the lessons that I learned, and I can talk a little bit about the politics as well. But, sometimes a project makes a lot of sense and folks seem to be for it, but there's an undercurrent that's maybe not always like visible of other folks who simply don't want the project done. And it can be for lots of different reasons. And you have to pay attention to those currents. And I think there also have to be times when it's time to pull the plug on a project. Like the project that went sideways was one that I felt like it was such a great win for all of the partners, and it would have been. But there were people who were just adamantly opposed to it, and they were opposed to it for reasons that were not rational. They were not reasons that I could have a conversation and explain things to them and it would change. And on that project, we should have pulled it sooner. But I saw the value in the project and I thought the partnership would hold together. It's at this point, it's probably the biggest disappointment of my career. It was a good project. It just should have happened. And the fact that it didn't makes me really sad. And I also learned a lot. So that's the other thing, is when the projects go sideways, use it as an opportunity to figure out how you're going to do it differently next time, because those lessons are certainly there.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, this has been incredibly valuable. Thank you for your time, Denise. And then thank you in advance for sharing your staff in the next few weeks. We look forward to those conversations as well. I know we all really benefited from this today. Thanks again.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for
Thanks,
inviting
Denise.
me. And everybody else too. I know they're looking forward to it.
Good. Let's give her a hand, folks. Okay, take care, Denise.
Thank
We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
please give my hellos to everyone else in the office that we're not going to be interacting with.
I will do that.
Great, thanks.
Mhm.